Vanguard Zombies has been kind of interesting to say the very least going into this, with a lot of complaints going here and there. But there's one thing in this game that has actually surprised me in how good it's been, especially right off the bat, and that's the storyline. And considering that we really only have a very small amount of story in this, even lacking a main Easter egg to have that story to be told, there still is a decent amount through the radios, the quotes, the intro, and stuff like that. And honestly, I find it to be quite intriguing, and I honestly find it more intriguing than how Cold War Zombies started really up until Mauer. Like, it really is that interesting. So that's exactly what today's video is going to be focused on. Today, I'm going to be explaining the storyline of Vanguard Zombies in as much depth as I can, and as I said, surprising amount of story to be explained here. But let's not waste any more time and let's jump right into this video. This story starts in a very similar place to so many zombie storylines before it. And when this is towards the end of World War II. More specifically, in this case, this was directly after the fall of the Germans in Stalingrad, where many people back in Germany saw that with this defeat, the war was all but decided against them. And because of this, and realizing they could no longer win militarily, they started to look into different avenues to potentially bring them back into the war. And this is when the group Wahrheit was created, which, by the way, translated to English means the truth. Regardless, this group was set to be led by a man named Oberfuhrer von List. And with this, they set off in their goal to somehow bring Germany back into this war by using not scientific, but instead supernatural or magical ways. And to do this, they scoured Germany for people who could potentially be experts in these fields. And this has included archaeologists, explorers, historians, and finally, and probably most importantly, a demonologist named Dr. Gabriel Krafft. Now, he'll be very important later in the story, but for now, the only thing we want to mention about him is something he stressed inside the map in his radios. And what this was is that many of the experts, himself included, did not join this group willingly. In his case, he had his friend killed in order to threaten him, and then he, along many of the other experts, were thrown into a prison, and only after that, for many of them, did they join this group in order to have their freedom back. But even in the case of Krafft, who still denied and would rather stay in the prison, it wasn't till they threatened his wife till he finally started working with the group. Regardless though, this is when the group sets off to find these mystical things that could potentially help Germany win the war. And the things that they first look into are things like Thor's hammer, Shangri-La, and finally Atlantis. And at least as of now, we don't believe they got anywhere with those. But that's not to say they didn't find anything. And this is when, from somewhere, not sure where, but where these experts told von List of these artifacts. Now, these artifacts were said to be used by sorcerers and priests of the ancient world and used them to summon demons and talk to angels. And with this information, the Wahrheit is sets off to collect all of these artifacts. And after scouring all these different places around the world, they found 5 of them. And these were found in Egypt, Greece, Iceland, Mexico, and finally Japan. And after collecting all 5 of these artifacts, absolutely nothing happened, and these artifacts just seemed like nothing more than ancient artifacts and had nothing to do with angels or demons. And because of this, all seemed lost for the Wahrheit. But that all changed, and this was entirely incredibly lucky for von List, because after not being able to do anything with his methods that he'd been trying to do, luckily for him, there was another group doing something quite similar to him, but instead of trying to save Germany from falling by using supernatural and magical methods, they were using science. And what this group was called was Endstation. And at the same time all this was happening with the Wahrheit, End station was in Moscow, Poland, and they had recently made a cyclotron and ran it. And when they ran it, an accident happened. And when this accident happened, it opened up a rift. And this rift connected this world to the dark ether. And this caused its own zombies outbreak in Moscow, Poland that had its own story that I'm sure anybody who's played Cold War is familiar with. But this isn't the video to get into that story. But what is important for this story is that rift they created. Because this rift created a connection between this world and the dark ether. And because of that, those artifacts were reconnected to what was thought to be their demons. And here's where we see Von List touch one of these artifacts. And when he does, he is connected to a demon. And this is where he learns that this demon really isn't just a demon, but instead a dark ether entity. And it just isn't any regular dark ether entity, it is Kortifex. Now, he's not the only dark ether entity tied to these artifacts because, as I mentioned, there were 5. So what I want to do is actually spend some time talking about the dark ether entities and slightly about the past that we do know about them. Starting off with the one we just mentioned, Kortifex, or as he's known, Kortifex the Deathless. And what we know about him is that his artifact was found in Egypt somewhere near the pyramids of Giza. And because of its location where it's been found and also radios in the game, we do know why it was in Egypt, because one of the pharaohs from ancient times had a connection to him and used his powers in the past. But another thing we learned about Kortifex is that he is the most powerful dark ether entity, and in fact was once the ruler of the dark ether itself. And more on this in a bit, but now we'll move on to the other ones. The next one is Nordicus the Conqueror, whose artifact was found in Iceland, and what we know about him is not as much as Kortifex, but one thing that is important is that he was once a general for Kortifex and was a very good general, as you could imagine why he's called Nordicus the Conqueror. The next one we know of is Belikar the Warlock, and her artifact was found in the Yucatan near the Maya's pyramids. And what we know about Belikar's past is kind of conflicting because we hear from her that she didn't really have anything to do with the ancient war in the dark ether, but at the same time we hear from Kortifex that she's always been a thorn in his side. So we're not exactly sure what her role was in the ancient dark ether. But we do learn a little bit about how she was when she was interacting with humans, because what we learn from Krafft is that she was one of the very few dark ether entities who was benevolent to humans, which seems to be quite rare between them. Next, there was Saraxis the Shadow, whose artifact was found in Greece somewhere in Athens. We actually don't know much about her. The only thing we really do know is that she doesn't seem to treat humans too well, and she more treats them as entertainment or her playthings. But at the same time, she claims that she knows more about humans than even Belikar, which we were told was the most benevolent, so not sure exactly what to make of her. But then finally there is Invictor the Destroyer, who is actually his location of his artifact is not shown to us in the intro like all the other artifacts and dark ether entities, but we do learn from a radio from Krafft that his artifact was found in Japan. Not sure where in Japan, but generally somewhere in Japan. But besides that, we really don't know much about him. He's very mysterious in general, and if I had to assume something by just how his general demeanor and being the one who seems like he's most against Kortifex, it seems to me that he potentially could have been one of Kortifex's enemies in the past, but that is just an assumption from me. The last thing I'll mention about him though is that it is interesting that he looks quite similar to the Forsaken as we saw in the Cold War story. And that's all of the 5 current dark ether entities that we are currently aware of. But the question then becomes, why are these dark ether entities tied to these artifacts? Well, we actually learn in one of the radios that these artifacts were actually created in the dark ether, and potentially they were created by the dark ether entities that they are tied to. And what they did was, after creating these dark ether artifacts, they sent them somehow, we're not sure exactly how that happened, but they somehow sent these artifacts from the dark ether to the regular world. And they did this because these dark ether entities wanted to interact with this world, but they were unable to physically get here. So they made these artifacts in order to bond with humans and would grant them some of their powers and also allow them to come here in some of a spiritual way. And based on where these artifacts were found, we could probably tell a little bit of what they did here and there, especially with Belikar and the Yucatan, and even Cortifex with the Pharaohs. But there's also something quite interesting about these dark ether entities, and it's that we actually know a little bit about their past and what they were doing in the dark ether. And this story is quite interesting because what happened with these dark ether entities is that at one point, we're not sure exactly when, Cortifex fought a war in the dark ether and won it, then became the ruler of the dark ether. But this didn't last very long, because soon after his rule started, a lot of formerly disconnected groups started working together, and they created a group that would turn on Cortifex for they could overthrow him. And it just wasn't these groups, even people of his own army turned on him, and most importantly, someone called Nordicus, his own general, turned on him, and with this group created that fought against Cortifex, they were able to defeat him and overthrow him from being the ruler of the Dark Ether. And after his defeat, he swears vengeance upon the people who betrayed him, and also just the people who just generally defeated him, and swore that he will one day reclaim his throne upon the Dark Ether. But now returning back to Von List, and right as he touched Cortifex's artifact. After touching his artifact, he's able to directly talk and communicate with Cortifex. And with this, they learn the situation between each other and they make a deal. Where in this deal, Cortifex offers Von List power that would include raising an undead army to snatch victory for Germany, and also to somehow help Cortifex to get his throne back in the Dark Ether, and also get vengeance on all that betrayed him. Now, it's unclear exactly how Von List is going to help Cortifex do this, but we do know that something's going on there. Regardless though, Von List's plans go into motion, and he returns to Stalingrad for two reasons he says himself. One is because he finds it to be very symbolic, because this was a place that he and many other people in Germany saw that Germany lost the war after their defeat here, and he thought that it would be symbolic that this would be the place to where they gained back power in order to win the war. And second, and probably the real reason why he returned here, is because the Eastern Front has the most dead bodies probably ever. Millions and millions of people died here, and he needs millions and millions of bodies in order to create his undead army. And in the intro to Vanguard, we see Von List succeed in this. He collects all of the dead bodies and he brings them back as zombies. But not everything was going great for him, because while he is doing this, someone betrayed him, and who that someone is someone he'd been keeping close to him, because sure, he made the deal with Cortifex, but he didn't entirely trust Cortifex, so he kept someone who would be the closest thing to an expert on these dark ether entities, or maybe even demons, and that's none other than the demonologist, because Gabriel Krafft, after seeing him succeed in what he was doing in Stalingrad, realized he needed to do something to stop him, and this is when he radioed to the Allies for help. And on top of that, and very much more significantly, also stole 4 of the other artifacts. And after Von List learns of this betrayal, he goes to apprehend him, but Krafft was a step ahead because he had learned rune magic, and he used this rune magic to seal himself in a room that prevented Von List from getting him. The only problem was that he was unable to do the rune magic himself. So as of currently, he is trapped in this room somewhere in Stalingrad, which by the way is totally not going to be a part of the main Easter egg when we finally get it. Regardless though, Von List, not to be outsmarted, he uses the power of Cortifex to set up a containment spell that does two things. One, it's in the name, it's a containment spell to allow Krafft to not to be able to escape, but also it weakens any other Dark Aether entity inside of it, which is significant because Krafft had 4 other Dark Aether artifacts that were tied to Dark Aether entities, so even if he did use them, these Dark Aether entities would be weakened. But luckily for Krafft, before the containment spell was put into place, the allies sent in support. And who they sent in was none other than the Vanguard, which is not significant to many people, but if you played the campaign, then you know, and I'm not going to explain, just know that they are supposed to be the most special of special soldiers. Regardless though, the Vanguard were able to arrive before the containment spell went up, which is not great for them because they're currently trapped in the containment spell, but is good for Krafft because he has some allies to work with. And this is when Krafft hands over the 4 other artifacts to the 4 people in the Vanguard. And when he gives them these artifacts, he tells them to bond with the Dark Aether entity inside this. And this is what they do, and is why we are bonded with these field upgrades inside the map. Now, when the Vanguard bond to these Dark Aether entities, they are given powers, but as I mentioned, these powers are weakened because of the containment spell. But at least it gives them some way to fight back, and also someone who has some insight on what Cortifex is all about, and potentially how to fight back against him. And that is exactly what they did. They found some ways to fight against them, and this is exactly what the objectives are when you do them in game. But let me explain exactly how that works. And the first one is actually Blitz. And what's important about these objectives is that they're all tied to a different Dark Aether entity. And Blitz is tied to Invictor. And what Invictor does is send us to a weak point in Cortifex's containment spell. And here we are set to kill as many of zombies that are under Cortifex's control as fast as possible. And why we do this is because these zombies are tied directly to Cortifex and his power. And the more we kill, the more power Cortifex loses. And this is why we hear in game, after completing a Blitz objective from Von List, that Cortifex now has to rest, but he will be back. It really just is a temporary way to hold back Cortifex from doing anything more. It won't defeat him, but it will keep him at bay. The next one is Harvest, and Harvest is tied to Saraxis. And this is where Saraxis teleports us to a place where a obelisk has appeared. And this obelisk is a way to power up our Dark Aether entities who, as mentioned before, are weakened by the containment spell. But to power them up and give at least some part of their power back, they have to get power from somewhere. And where they get this from is Cortifex. Because, as I mentioned in the Blitz objective, the zombies are directly tied to Cortifex and his power. And here we are using runes to steal that power from Cortifex through his zombies. And after we take that power, we put it into the obelisk, then charge our own Dark Aether entities, giving them some of their power back. But then there's the final objective, Transmit, and this one is tied to Be'lakor. And this one is where Be'lakor teleports us to a place that has a weak point not in the containment spell, but a weak point between this world and the Dark Aether. And to find this weak point, Be'lakor, with the help of Krafft, built this zombie head orb thing. And what this does is seek out this weak point between this world and the Dark Aether. And after walking alongside this thing in order to find this weak point, the zombie head orb uses that weak point to teleport from this world to the Dark Aether. but it doesn't teleport there without purpose, because alongside this orb, Belicard sends a message. And who this message is to is any enemies of Cortifex that wish to stop him from becoming the ruler of the Dark Aether, or generally just becoming powerful once again, and if any of them want to join in the fight against him. And as you guys maybe be able to tell with this is probably going to be the explanation for why we get more field upgrades that are tied to even more Dark Aether entities. And those are the 3 objectives. Now, I will point out that Nordicus is one of our Dark Aether entities currently, but as you guys could tell, he's not currently tied to any of the different objectives. Potentially, he could be tied to the exfil, but I just don't see that as something that is actually happening. And speaking of that exfil, and to really end off this storyline explained video, is what exactly is going on there? Because are we escaping this containment spell that we've been talking about this whole time? I mean, the whole point of this is that we're trapped in this containment spell, so if we use this exfil to leave the containment spell, aren't we done? We succeeded? Well, not exactly, because what we learned from Nordicus when we do this exfil is that we are not actually escaping the containment spell. Instead, we are just going to a different place that is in the containment spell, but it's just pretty much a safe room to have a break until we come back to try again to find a way to escape the containment spell. And that's where the story currently ends off. And that's about it for this storyline explained video. I'd love actually to hear what you guys think of this Vanguard story thus far. As I said at the start of the video, I actually find it to be quite intriguing just how interesting it is right off the bat. Like, it's just insane because like Cold War just didn't start like this. And this one, there's so many things that interest me, especially with the Dark Aether entities and their past and their connection to the ancient times. Like, what is all going on there? There's so many questions that we could go off from here, and it's just what I really like about the story. But regardless, again, as I said, I'd love to hear what you guys think of this. But that's about it for me. If you guys did enjoy the video and you found it entertaining in any way, shape, or form, definitely do all the normal YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, bell, share, all that great stuff. But I'm gonna go, and I'll catch you guys next stream video, or whatever the heck it may be, and laters, guys.